I put in this quote I saw that was
That you sent to me the other day.
Did I send this to you? I did send it to you the other day. I need to fix it because I feel like I kind of want to talk about the grammar at the end of the quote, or not the grammar, but the date at the end of the quote, because I felt like I sent it to you. I thought it was really good. I really liked it. It's a good perspective shift. It's just kind of one of those things where it's I feel like we live in a world where there's a lot of bait and switching. So before I go into like, starting to, ponder on it, I or discuss it, I'll read the quote. I'll read the quote the way it was originally, and not how I have it typed in here, but the way it was originally said. But
so maybe real quick before you read the quote.
Yeah.
And you have another placeholder in here that I thought about responding in the notes, and let's count it as housekeeping first before we delve into it.
Oh yes, I forgot about that.
And it's just that no, we didn't talk about crossing the 200 episode barrier, and I thought about it, but then I thought, well, 250 is not that far away, and so like personally, I started thinking about maybe some alternative things for hitting that 250 that would be of interest, but I haven't obviously shared any thoughts either. But I do know for sure we didn't call out 200 because I haven't shared those thoughts either.
Okay. I was not expecting such a specific answer. I thought you'd be maybe in the same boat as me and be like, maybe we didn't. And then I realized, 15, that had been 15 weeks ago as we record, which would have been early July. And I'm very proud of us for not calling out episode 200, as it is a round number divisible by 10. Oh, 4-2. But then I realized, but when you said 50 is not that far away, that's over a year away from 200.
But in the grand scheme of us planning things, that's right around the corner. Because my thought was episode 250 might be an interesting one to try to do in person, just to kind of see how things work acoustically.
Yeah.
And I wanted to kind of wrap my head around a couple of things there before I even mentioned it. But now we're mentioning it because you asked about 200. So, cat's out of the bag. But still, it's something that within the next couple of weeks, I probably would have tested a couple of things and then mentioned it anyway. So, not a big deal. It's not like it's a big secret for sure. But I did think that we haven't done any real special episode for any milestones. 250 felt like one that maybe we should at least do something a little bit different.
Yeah.
And what would be different would be, let's try it in person. Yeah.
Yeah. So, the phrase "the cat's out of the bag." This is a thing that lives rent free in my head. When I was in college, I was at some point. I think the first major that I actually declared and actually took classes towards was biology. The first 2 years, I was just like, maybe I'll be this. Maybe definitely freshman year, I was like, maybe I'll be this. Maybe I'll be that, just because it was all new. And so I think by the end of my freshman year, I declared biology as a major. Yeah, for sure I did, because I took biology classes my sophomore year. And at one point, I took anatomy lab, or anatomy and human anatomy, and I had a corresponding anatomy lab when I was at UAB. And UAB was pretty cool because at the time they let undergrads dissect a human. Like, they had a human cadaver that we could dissect, and that was pretty cool. I don't think that happens. I don't think that was common in the early 2000s, and I'm pretty sure it's not a thing that any undergrad does now in the U.S. Maybe I'm wrong. But I remember telling somebody about that, and they're like, "Oh, that's probably not a thing these days." So anyway, I had a friend that was at Samford, and they were also taking human anatomy the same semester as me there, and they got to, they got to dissect cats. And so there was one guy that they were telling me about in their I guess their dissection team or lab partner. What I don't know how they had it broken up, but when they were ready to get started, somebody literally took a cat out of a bag, and one of the lab people was like, "Well, that's done now." and then they followed it up with, they had to remove skin from whatever section they were going to dissect, and he says, "I've heard there's more than one way to do this." So I just like real low key, just like some people got it, some people didn't, and nobody like burst out laughing. They're just like a couple of snickers among the lab partners, but it was just like, that dude's clever. He's like he might have should have quit. Maybe should have do some stand up on the side if he's any good at that. So
yeah, certainly some well placed humor.
For sure. When I took physiology, I had a lab partner who was disgusting in the sense that he studied. I don't want to say lightly, but he was never one to have to cram. He just got shit. He just knew stuff. Like it just like maybe he had somewhat of an eidetic memory, but he went to class, he read certain parts of the textbook, and he just knew it. And he's just like, he would actually come to lab not drunk but buzzed for sure, and just to like give himself a challenge. And I'm like, God. And he's probably a doctor now. He's probably been a doctor for 10 or 15 years now. So I don't remember his name, so I can't tell you to watch out for him. So anyway, I just remember that dude, and how it's like I'm glad you're a good, you're a human being that this comes easy to, because that's great, but man, this is not easy for me. So anyway, to the topic, if there was nothing else, no more ado.
Only one, and only because it's kind of funny. As you were talking about the particular partner, I was never bad enough to show up buzzed. But up until that point, you halfway described my experience throughout my entire college career.
Yeah, this is not a surprise to me.
And just because my approach has been different, I will emphasize that the reason I finished my college career was because I was tired of people telling me I didn't know what I was talking about when I had been studying that type of material for years anyway. So it was, for me, validation of what was self-explored and taught. I think in that particular scenario, I can be forgiven for not paying as much attention and just kind of showing up and putting in the minimal amount of effort to ace the exams and everything else anyway. But that's what came to mind, and I had to laugh a little bit. But then when you added the buzzed part, it's like, well, nope, that's where the similarity ends.
Well, I was just going to say, that made me think, it's like, at that point, it's like, somebody, if you're acing tests, the conversation you need to have with whoever's giving you a hard time is a short conversation. Probably just 2 words, 7 letters, 3 of them F.
Yes. I get a hard time from most everybody just because, it makes sense, right? I'm talking about all sorts of things from psychology and sociology. My career path was IT. You can't really fault people for questioning my knowledge on subject matter in something that I had no specific educational or academic or professional reference to know. So I do acquiesce to that to an extent, but it should have been pretty clear shortly after engaging in conversation that it wasn't just ad hoc knowledge,
Yeah, unless they didn't know.
Right. So for me, it was a lot of it was just a giant FU to people who claimed that I didn't know what I was talking about, which is on brand for me, to be fair.
When you say that, it made me think. I know you didn't go there, but it made me think. Oh, maybe you should have gone to Furman University. Because I always think about that. And am I right in thinking that Furman University's mascot are the Christian Knights?
They might be.
That's always a thing I've heard, but I'm like, I've also heard other things that are definitely not true. Like what the actual that there was people used to say that FUCK was an acronym for fornication under consent of the king, and that's been debunked. But I kind of wondered about Furman University was one of them. There's another one that's like that. There's some school. I think there's some school in Wisconsin that I don't know. I'll see if I can provide feedback. And this is. We've allowed the ado to further more than it should.
Fair, but it was.
I'm hacking Shakespeare. Yeah, no,
it was
totally,
funny,
totally worth it.
But yes, so back to the precursor to the adieu. You had mentioned a quote. I'll let you convey the quote, whichever version of it you would prefer. The essence is the same, so I don't want to make it sound like it's different versions whatsoever. It's just I imagine one of them was kind of typed from memory as opposed to what was played and what you shared more so than anything else. But the sentiment is absolutely the same, and it's an interesting concept. So that's
I love it.
That's my introduction for you.
I love a good paradigm shift title. The quote is, in America, when a black person does something for the first time, it's not black progress. It's white progress. When a woman does something for the first time, it's not woman progress, it's man progress. Black people and women have been overqualified for every position in America since the 3rd of July, 1776.
Yeah, so I've been sitting with this particular thought since you shared it, because I don't disagree. My immediate gut feel takeaway is that maybe there's not a hard date that you put on overqualification, but that's semantics, because I don't think it was that late either.
No,
but I'm okay. Wasn't. I'm okay with the sentiment conveyed. Like I get where it comes from the standpoint of it was an old white guys club for a long time, and as soon as it became something officially recognized, it was not just old white guys that were capable. And so I get the jab. That's my only qualm, honestly, with it, is that the date is far more modern than what I think is actually applicable. And for that to be my only qualm with it, that's being very nitpicky. I get it.
Yeah. When I put it in the notes, I put the 4th of July because it's like the 3rd of July, the United States didn't officially exist. It was they were British colonies, and then the 4th of July. And so it's not that important, but I was kind of wondering why he picked the 3rd of July instead of the 4th of July, because at that point on the 4th of July we're all Americans. The colonists were all Americans in their eyes as they as they declared it. Maybe not all of them, because I'm sure that I know that there were British supporters, so or British loyalists. I think they were called loyalists. But so that's neither here nor there. I just thought it was interesting that the original quote said the 3rd of July. So
yeah, to me it does make a lot of sense, because if you're taking a very American view, right, and trying to apply it to your fellow Americans, it makes sense to use the demarcation point of the formation of the country as a reference.
Yeah.
So, while I have some nitpicky feelings about why that was chosen, that's purely driven from my lack of wanting to identify and sublabel groups more so than anything else. It doesn't affect the gist of the quote. Go ahead.
Go ahead. I was going to say go ahead.
The other thing that I'd really like to just kind of back up and emphasize, we think about different groups making progress as being exemplary on that group for showing some level of achievement above and beyond the stereotype. And that's what this is kind of born from. The problem is it's a very unearned stereotype when you think about the differences between people. It's only these particular stereotypes are only created by a group who is in power and threatened by change to that power dynamic, as opposed to stereotypes that are born out of actual behavior and action. And I know that can be difficult to follow. So as this was something that I thought about, I also thought about a good example where women didn't have the right to vote until very recent history, right?
20th century.
So thinking about the capabilities of women in general and where they fell in the social hierarchy was a completely arbitrary and socially constructed role designed purely to allow, there's no nice way to phrase it, designed purely to allow men to continue to control and have other
men.
People subservient to them. Yes. Well, I would argue that there's a period where it's not just white men.
That's true. That's true. Well, at first it was white men, then it was like, okay, all men, and then it was like, okay, what, some women, and
I don't want to nitpick on that distinction, but I do. The only reason I want to mention it is because historically, up until 2024, as we speak, women have still been viewed as a group of people to be dominated and subservient to other people.
Yes.
And it's an ongoing problem that is still perpetuated by these same general failures of society to recognize this key idea, which is for all the progress that we attribute to women, women haven't really had that level of progress. They've been, it's bad phrasing, and I recognize it's bad phrasing, but it's male progress in recognizing capable women that is still falling short.
Yeah. So, all of this, all of these ideas like, oh, black progress, women progress, all of that is designed to make you think good things are happening. But what's actually happening is at every chance, every level, actual progress is being stymied. There's no progress. Black people and women are accomplishing things despite the lack of progress. It made me think of where did the term climate change? For a while people were, I'd say, I guess in the 1980s, I'm not sure if there was discussion or scientific papers written in the 1970s, but I know by the 1980s, there are papers being written about not climate change but global warming, and at some point there was a shift to climate change, and that was done on purpose, not to be more accurate, but to take the focus away from what was actually happening. Climate change is global warming. Climate change is global warming. It just doesn't sound as ominous. Same thing with the littering campaign. There was a whole, again, my recollection only goes back to the mid 1980s. So, if we have a listener that can correct us, or we, come across it for follow up, which we won't, because it's not important at this detail is not important. But in the 1980s, you heard about not littering, and there was a lot of focus on individual citizens doing their part to prevent litter, clean up litter, recycle, reduce, reuse, recycle. And those are all great things. Like none of that is bad, but it was intended to take away focus from the dismantling of the EP, or not the dismantling, but the what's the word I'm looking for, where we have pulled all of the power away from a particular organization. What am I looking for here?
So I kept going to defenestration to try to keep with the DE aspect. That's not the right word either, but I like the connotation. Um, Gutting the ability of the agency to perform.
Dismantling.
Well, it wasn't truly dismantled.
Not dismantling, but...
Because I thought about that too, but that's why I went back to defenestration. And then I just got caught in my own self-fulfilling loop of thinking about somebody tossing someone out a window. But
oh my goodness, yeah. So the essential, the gutting of the EPA and I'm trying to remember the other organizations, but they almost lasted a decade. The Clean Water the Clean Water Act was passed in the early 1970s. The Clean Air Act was passed, and by the 1980s, they still existed, but they were. I really can't think of the word. I just keep thinking of the scene from Swingers, where he's like, "You got claws, you got fangs," and the EPA has no claws and no fangs anymore. They're down on.
You could say they were disarmed.
For sure. That's a good.
And the fascinating thing is it's not that dissimilar from recent changes in legislation.
Oh yeah. We're still doing it.
I just lost it.
The Chevron. It's still happening.
The Chevron.
Yes. Is it the Chevron Accord?
I can't remember the other wording, but same idea, right? Where federal agencies who have been tasked with specific mandates are slowly being eroded of their powers to perform their mandates. And we have decades of the Supreme Court trending in this same general direction to thank for the overall gutting of federal regulation at every turn. And I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing on principle, but the actions that have been taken have not been taken in good faith. And that's where I have a problem with it. Yeah,
well, I mean, if you look at, there's real-time follow-up, it's the Chevron Act.
Okay.
Yep. But yeah, I agree with you on principle. That is how our government was created. It was created to enact and unact various laws, and it was meant to be changed. Our founding fathers. I think when people think, "Oh, what would the founding fathers think?" The founding fathers would think, "Shut up! We wrote this document, and then we immediately." We wrote the document. We declared independence. We wrote a constitution. We wrote the constitution in such a way that a change order process was created, and then we immediately used it. That's what the founding fathers would have expected us to do. They wouldn't have expected us to think about what they would have thought, what they would have done. They would have said, "No, the world is." I don't think they would have anticipated how much the world would have changed. But maybe they would have, because they could look back 500 years and think, a lot has changed since the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, and so they provided us with the change order process, and they showed us how to use it, and we're over here like clutching our pearls trying to figure out what they would do, and they showed us, they led by example, so. The problem has been that while the change order process hasn't been used for good, it's been used to further corruption. It's been used to support where the money's coming from, and that's from corporations. It doesn't matter. If there was a bill that was introduced by Congress or the Senate, it doesn't matter if it had like 70-80% support from citizens. If it's not being supported by corporations, it's not going to pass, or it's unlikely to pass. So, yeah. So, back to this original quote about progress, I think this narrative has been created to make us think progress is being made, and what it's doing is it is a stronghold to prevent progress from furthering.
So it's interesting. I'm trying not to be overly pessimistic, but I really want to be.
Go for it.
Backing up a step or two, talking about how the process exists for making changes. We've pointed to the same general symptom number of times, where it assumes there is a functioning level of all three branches of government. And what we currently have a problem with is that the legislative branch, for an extended period of time, is incapable of fulfilling the responsibilities assigned the legislative branch. That's the nice way to put it.
They're just over there filling their pockets.
Pretty much. The executive branch has attempted to fulfill its duties to the best of its ability, regardless of which person or party is in power. Some caveats, obviously, but I'll even be lenient and say, even to the extent of disagreement with a number of things, the executive branch has at least attempted to function as the executive branch is defined to function.
Well, that's because 25 years ago is when they began their power grab, and they were successful at it.
Well, even with that though, there has not been a lack of attempting to function within the confines of what the executive branch has been defined to function as. I don't agree with a lot of it. Like, I'm trying very hard to craft the statement in a way that acknowledges there are gray areas and some exemptions and other things that the executive branch can attempt to do and has exercised and has been met with the quote-unquote appropriate challenges when overstepping bounds. So at a core functioning level, the executive branch has generally worked as designed, is kind of how I would phrase it. The problem that we have with that is that the executive branch really doesn't have a lot of leeway in anything other than foreign affairs. Everything else is very narrowly defined and constructed in a way that attempting to circumvent it tends to be met with a fairly quick and immediate legal challenge that is maybe drawn out in resolution, but typically still reins in the powers of the executive branch.
Yeah. It's
real tricky to define from that standpoint, because there's always an exception, as talking with anything within the confines of the judicial system anyway, but there's also always an exception with regard to executive power and where they can find a way to maneuver that stays within the narrowly defined bounds that the executive branch has. I think that's a fairly diplomatic way to put it, right? So that particular branch of government has at least generally functioned. Maybe not functioned well, but functioned nonetheless.
So maybe at least the least worst.
Yeah, I think that's kind of what I'm getting at. And then you get to where the judicial branch theoretically would be a very solid counterpoint to a functioning executive and legislative branch, right? But the problem that we've encountered in recent history is that the judicial branch has abandoned its self-defined, self-imposed kind of guardrails in favor of whatever the majority decides is important to the majority. And the balance and check to that is a fully functional, healthy legislative branch. without that fully functional and healthy legislative branch, that judicial branch basically has complete and unopposed ability to shape, mandate, and enforce whatever the fuck it chooses.
Yeah, they've been given a blank check, and they're like, "Who? What could go wrong?"
And
Well,
that's where we have a problem, because the lack of a functioning legislative branch is the kryptonite to the design of the founding fathers.
and I'll throw this in here, and the fourth branch, the unofficial fourth branch, has also been tainted. There was nothing done to prevent the takeover from entities that choose to control their messaging. So,
foreign powers. I mean, it's
speaking-
not
speaking
necessarily
of,
all foreign, but it's
I was thinking of corporations, and let me the news reporting media being the journal, news reporting and investigative journalism being the unofficial fourth branch, is now owned by corporations, and those corporations, they'll have influence. I can imagine that. If somebody wants to run a story on the NBC Nightly News that doesn't put GE in a good light, I imagine that somebody from the executive levels of 30 Rock are gonna send a memo down to the NBC Nightly News and be like, nope, kill the story.
it's kind of a good counterpoint that I don't know for sure if the phrasing is going to be right. I think I'm going to get the message across. We'll see. The ability of the legislative branch to function appropriately is kind of tied to the existence of independent journalism. But the tie to independent journalism, even though it was never defined, it was assumed that there would always be someone willing to publish the truth. And that if the truth wasn't readily apparent or readily known, there would always be somebody else willing to investigate and publish the truth. And I don't know exactly when we deviated from that idea with regard to journalistic integrity, but it's been at least 40 years.
That's the numbers I've heard. It started in the early 80s was the beginning of the erosion of journalistic integrity.
And it feels like it was more based on the absorption and consolidation of resources than it was an attempt to erase the ability of journalists to be independent fact checkers. It's just that an undesired byproduct of that consolidation necessitates answering to some authority. And that's kind of the problematic relationship between most journalists and the ability to publish what they investigate.
The problem is that nobody took it, or the problem was there are always going to be nefarious opportunists looking for opportunities. And the only way to counteract that is to expect that and to proactively take measures to prevent that. If the solution, which I expect it has been, is to react to those things, it's too late.
I want to go on record as saying I'm not comfortable playing the optimistic of the two of us. I very much prefer being on the other side, but
yeah.
It's a fascinating thing to ponder, because I've seen the transition from independent journalists to conglomerations to a subset of journalists attempting to branch out and go back to their, I'm going to say, investigative roots. I don't know if that's quite the right phrasing, but it's almost like there has been a recent course correction that is in its infancy, where people who took their, not oaths, but their desired profession, what they chose to pursue as a lifelong passion, very seriously, have attempted to find and carve out those ways to share independent journalism again that maybe disappeared. And the primary problem with it now is that it took a little bit too long. And so people have become very distrustful, is probably a good way to think of it, of anything that they hear via certain outlets. And if you have any kind of ancillary relationship to that outlet, you become tainted as a byproduct. So even though you might be attempting to fulfill that, I'm going to call it journalistic duty, that's maybe making it overly honorable, but you get the idea that that subset of people who are really wanting to get the truth out and document it and share that information have become tainted by previous professional relationships in a way that's very difficult to transcend. This may be a good way to think of it. And I think it will be fascinating to see what happens with that subset of semi-independent journalists over the course of the next 2 to 4 years. My concern is that they are silenced within the next 365 days as a result of other administrative challenges. And so we could be at a point where things change for the better, but we could also be at a point where that movement dies irrevocably and never to recover, depending on the outcome in a couple of weeks. You know, for me, it's kind of fascinating to think about both from a behavioral standpoint in the things that I've seen and a professional standpoint in crafting and sharing a message, because I see both of those being more prolific and falling kind of flat. And I think a lot of it is that subset still trying to figure out how to validate itself, I think is maybe a good way to think of it.
Mm-hmm. As you were saying that, I was thinking about how the area of journalism is always going to attract people of high integrity, people who want to do the right thing, people that, regarding journalism, have exemplary morals. The problem is that those people are now the young shepherd in a David and Goliath scenario.
Or just really old and trying to...
Yeah.
They're tainted by their professional history and trying to break away just enough from that to show the integrity that drove them throughout their career. There's an astonishing amount of that I have seen in the past, I'd say 2 years.
Are you referring to Dan Rather?
Not exclusively, no. But he is definitely one that, yes.
Okay.
And I think part of why I have been fascinated by it is because I made a choice to engage in a particular profession, kind of shift gears. We've talked about it, but my focus is crafting and sharing the story. Completely legitimate, like not crafting something that is not the story itself, but really driving into who you are as a person or as an organization and what it is that makes you you. And there's a element of that I have seen in journalistic spheres that's really trying to combat the mass media is going to lie to you narrative that we've heard for a while. And it's struggling is maybe the best way to put it, because people are very distrustful at this point of those particular outlets. And I get it, and I sympathize with it, especially knowing how I go about taking and creating this particular story that you want to tell as an extension of what I do. And where most people, I think, miss the the key detail is that crafting a narrative is not the same thing as creating a story to make you feel better. Instead, it's a focus on taking this fundamental truth and sharing it in a way that conveys this truth without changing the meaning. And that's kind of where we are as a, I'm not going to say as an agency or consumer, but as an outsider looking at how these journalists are trying to figure out how to get their message to resonate. They are failing a little bit on that understanding and basic integrity level because of previous professional relationships. And so over the next year or two, it will be interesting to see how many independent groups arise and kind of take that movement, might be a bit strong of a word, but it's kind of what I'm leaning toward. But take and run with that banner, maybe is a good way to think of it, and showcase how, yes, you can be somewhat distrustful of this brand or this previous relationship, and yet acknowledge and embrace the truth of this particular story, because we can show you the development of that story in a very concise window. I feel like I rambled a bit there, but there's a dynamic that I think is to be seen, that I can see really changing the narrative if it's allowed to continue, I think is a good way to summarize what I was getting at. It's so difficult to explain without it being able to be pinpointed as a group. I get it. If I wasn't semi-ancillarily attached to that field, for lack of better thoughts, I wouldn't see it for what it is either. But there's a lot of interest in the past 6 to 8 months in crafting and telling an honest story that I really think is the beginning of a transition into seeing something different. It's going to be whether it gets a chance to play out.
Right.
And that's the part of me that's really concerned. Like, I'm really unsure if it's going to get a chance to play out.
I think on many levels, the issues that we're seeing, the issues that we've been experiencing practically our entire lives, appear to be on the cusp of a positive change. But the concern is that the existing power holders are trying to squash and strangle those changes. I mean, we've certainly seen many incremental steps in the right, we've seen incremental progress our whole lives, but it feels because of the extreme resistance and the desire to revert back to the good old days, and that being good old days for the existing power structure. It feels like at any moment we could lose the progress that, well, we've already seen that we've lost progress that has been made, and it feels like there could be a collapse of the progress that we've made. Not just we lost this and we lost that, and we see that things mentioning things like the Chevron Act being overruled, the repeal of Roe versus Wade. All of those things are definitely canaries in the coal mine, but hopefully we're on the cusp of a good and positive change for the people that live, not just people that live in this country, but people, our global community.
I guess to put it relatively succinctly, older white men still control too much shit.
That's right. I saw a graph, and I didn't fact check the graph, but it certainly feels this way. But it was a graph of wealth distribution, current or wealth distribution in the early 21st century, and it shows the bottom 20%, 20 to 40%, and so on. And it does show, it breaks out each percentage. It's each 10%. It breaks it out every 10%, and the top 10%, owns a staggering amount of, or has a staggering amount of wealth. Like, you take the bottom 90% and you add it up. I don't even think that it is. It might be a quarter of what the top 10% has. And then it was compared to the wealth distribution in France between 1760 and 1790. And it was actually, the wealth distribution was ever so slightly more fair to the top 20%, or from 11 to 20%. They had a little more than our current 11 to 20%.
I saw this particular chart myself too.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it's true or not, but it certainly feels like that's probably not untrue.
Well, it's very similar to. Have you heard the argument that every civilization, once taxed at about 30%, revolts? Does that sound familiar?
It does.
Again, not something I have fact checked either, but from a behavioral standpoint, makes a lot of sense. And we have been at or above that particular level for longer than I would care to exist as well. You start to think about disgruntlement and divisiveness, and a lot of the things that are very feeling oriented that you may or may not be able to quantify in some fashion, but you could definitely point to as existing. And you add in this idea of exorbitant taxation, especially with regard to return on investment as a citizen. And it actually becomes very surprising that we haven't seen even more extreme disgruntlement than we have seen. That's a really, really nice way of putting it, by the way. Mm-hmm. And it's only a matter of time before those stressors play out. How they play out is really the question. Because if you go back in history and you look at prominent thinkers of any timeline, you can point to a particular point of breaking by the masses in general, leading the complete and utter ruin and destruction of the governing class at that particular time. It's the same pattern over and over. And what that particular breaking point is tends to be mostly focused on an ability to survive without feeling overly oppressed. And it's very subjective, and I'm intentionally crafting it in a way that is not pointing to a specific risk factor, because of how you can interpret it over history. But if you want to attempt to quantify it, there are commonalities. You can go do your own research on it. I don't want to be a naysayer, doom prognosticator, etc. Like that's just not something of interest. But that particular issue, in a nutshell, is what makes me feel more pessimistic about current events and potential trajectories and uncertainty than I would feel if particular patterns did not exist throughout the course of history. And it all leads to, I am very pessimistic about the outcome of the upcoming election and subsequent events that follow. Not because I don't have faith in humanity in general, but because particular patterns tend to replicate and play out in certain ways. And we're in a very questionable range of potential outcomes over the next couple of years for specific patterns. Again, very vague by definition and by desire. It alludes to other conversations we've had. I also want to be somewhat optimistic on my belief and thought that basic human decency will eventually overcome most problems. And so I'm balancing those with how I attempt to describe them for us recording. But at the end of the day, I'm betting on the worst case scenario, not because that's what I want, but because I'm scared as hell that that's going to be the reality that we end up in, and I need to make sure I figure out how to navigate it.
As in many times over, self-proclaimed optimist, I agree with you here. And at this point, the hope that I have is that we can get this train turned around for our children's and their children's generations. We have a number of different ways set up for you to get in touch with us to provide feedback, ask questions, or just comment in about something we've discussed.
You can hit us up on Twitter or Instagram at untitled_hosts, or shoot an email over to untitled.hosts@gmail.com.
Or get in touch directly with Jesse at jthart.com, or get in touch with me, John, via telepathy.
If you would like to support our work or are interested in listening to our new after show feed, head over to patreon.com/theUntitledPodcast and take a look at the options we have set up.
Thank you for listening.
We hope you've enjoyed the show.
And we hope to connect with more of you as we continue this journey.
That's a wrap.
Message to my fellow Americans. Remember, the first black person to do something in the United States is not black progress. It is white progress. The first woman to do something in the United States is not woman progress. It is man progress. Black people and women have been overqualified for every position in America since July 3rd, 1776. It is the progress of white people and of men to finally get over their racism and misogyny that is allowing people into those spaces. Remember that.